Welcome, everyone. So, I thought I would talk today a bit about the archetypal victim role and how to move out of it. If you're familiar with any of my work, you'll know that the first step is always recognition. And I find it really helpful to identify this role within ourselves to talk about the most severe presentations of it. Like, what happens when somebody is really stuck in the victim role? Because then we can start talking about shades of gray and how it lives out in the majority of us. So let's talk about somebody who is really stuck in the victim role. Most of us will have somebody in our lives that are like this. There will also be some overlap with one of my chakra videos, which is the darkest aspects of the first chakra, if you care to look at that video, because somebody who is very stuck in the victim role is not a terribly conscious person, or at least an aspect of themselves is not terribly conscious. So, what happens in the most severe presentations of the victim role? Or should I say somebody who is really stuck with it to the point that it is a fixed aspect of their personality? Often people come by the victim role honestly. They have been victimized at some point in their lives. People who are really fixed in this role tend to be people who were harmed as children in all the ways of the world in which harm can be visited upon children. But they, as adults, are still living that reality out, that they are still in that extreme powerlessness, vulnerability, victim role. Um, and so they most commonly will continue to live that out with the world and not recognize that they have crossed over to the point where they are utilizing their victimhood to abuse and harm other people. So let me explain a little bit further. In psychology, most of these people that we would talk about as being really fixed in this role would either be people who would be considered in kind of the cluster B group, which would be people that we would define as borderline personality disorder, as narcissistic, or as antisocial personality disorder, or what we might refer to as sociopathy. In spiritual terms, as well as with, kind of an understanding of psychology, we can see the cause and effect here. Often it is somebody who has been quite traumatized as a child, and so they got stuck in that stage of consciousness, even if they are an adult. Basically, a part of them is still an infant, still a 2-year-old, still a 6-year-old, still a 16-year-old, even if they're in a 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old body. And so there can be some compassion for the fact that somebody who is very stuck in this role is still very much living it out. But there can also be a recognition that people who are really stuck in this role tend to abuse others and then tend to claim that they are the victims in return. And so they will do everything but bullying, harassing, pushing people away, stalking, doing really just disturbing behavior, really unfortunate behavior. And then their response may be, well, nobody loves me, nobody wants me, I'm all alone in this world, this is what you're going to do anyway. That is kind of the most severe presentation. And for this, it would go probably more into the borderline personality disorder if we were to talk about psychological characteristics. Um, because this type of personality develops pretty severe fixations on people and pretty rigid identity complexes within themselves. And so that rigid type of identity, particularly identifying as the victim, is specifically what I'm talking about here, and especially people with personality disorders, but often a lot of people that may not be diagnosed psychologically or have not gone to be diagnosed psychologically, or plenty of the people in our lives who are struggling with other aspects of their mental health may be quite stuck in this role as well. And so a good framework to understand this is this rigidity of mind, this rigidity of identity. Because for those of us with a healthy mind, we are open to shifting our identity. We are open to shifting the roles that we embody. If we are a victim and that is our primary or dominant role, we're open to that taking a little bit of a backseat and maybe another archetypal role stepping forward. Basically, our minds can be open in a healthy capacity to take in information, especially new information, to consider it and to, utilize what works for us. Somebody who is rigidly stuck in the victim role needs to think of themselves that way. Anything else they are blind to or they will fight against. And sometimes this can create people who are quite delusional. This can also create people, many of whom we are aware of these days, who simply, no matter what information, what truth, what understanding, what reasoning you bring to them, that they are going to be an unreasonable person. And a lot of us have so much curiosity about this, about how there can be so much information out there, so much reasonable information. And, the thought of how you cannot reason with irrationality can come in. But especially if we're talking about somebody who is really stuck in a rigid and small place, their consciousness is quite contracted. It is going to be because of fear, because of unresolved emotions, and in this case, because of unresolved victimhood. What happens when somebody is very stuck in the victim role is that they will push out anything that would deny their victimhood. And so what ends up happening is that they will push out any negative qualities that they have onto other people, especially things like hatred, fear, anger. And I'm going to talk for a moment about self-righteousness. I've talked a lot in my work about the superiority inferiority loop and about how breaking through this is one of the primary gateways of spiritual awakening. Basically, it's one of those initiatory steps, and you can really tell if somebody has crossed that threshold or if they have not. If somebody has crossed that threshold, they no longer need to consider themselves as superior to other people morally, superior to other people in a way that is dehumanizing or causes for them to cast their shadow on others. This does not mean that we cannot recognize our attributes, by the way. For example, I might recognize that I'm better at painting than somebody else. That doesn't mean that I am dehumanizing them, that I am thinking less of them, or that I think that I am superior to them. It is just that I am a painter, and my painting capacity is, better than somebody that's never picked up a brush. This is also true when you have a more open mind, is that you recognize that whoever you are, however much you know, however conscious you are, there are always going to be people out there that are smarter, better, more conscious, more talented, whatever attribute you might want to put on it out there than you. And so people who are really stuck in the victim role, what tends to happen is that they use this idea of moral superiority or righteousness as a weapon. And they will wield that weapon as much as they can. They will tell everyone and everything how superior, how amazing they are, how much better they are than you, all of that sort of stuff. And the more reasonable of us can kind of take a little step back and be like, okay, the people that I have met who truly have been moral, who truly have been, whatever words you might want to put on it, who truly are superior in some spiritual, moral, emotional capacity, they don't feel the need to tell other people how wonderful they are and how terrible that somebody else is. They have gone far beyond that in their consciousness, in their recognition of their own talents, consciousness, intelligence, whatever we're talking about. And so it is common for people who are very stuck in the victim role to have a very specific narrative about themselves, about life, about what they are entitled and owed, and how reality, how other people have failed them, have denied them, have punished them, have abandoned them and rejected them. And this narrative serves a couple purposes. First of all, it may very well be the repeating of a narrative from childhood in which a child does not receive unconditional love, and in fact, a child may receive some form of abuse or trauma, and they carry that formative wounding into adulthood where they are still living out that victimhood from when they were two, when they are 45. But there are other purposes of being really stuck in this victimhood role. And one of them really has to do with shadow work, which is that if we deny large aspects of ourselves, what happens is that we need a person or a group to project them onto. Basically, we need somebody to project all of our dark qualities, all of our toxic qualities, all of the things that we cannot bear to stand to look at within ourselves onto another person. And so there's this thought with people who are very stuck in this role and do have that rigidity of mind, is that they will claim righteousness and at the same point be quite hypocritical. Basically, there's kind of a thought of, that's popularized these days, that every accusation is a confession. And this is very true for this group, is that everything that they are accusing you of in their grand scheme, their grand narrative of being the victim, is what they feel about themselves. You've just become a convenient source for them, a convenient object for them to project that onto. And I use that word object for a couple of reasons. And it is because people who are really stuck in that first chakra, darkest aspect of consciousness, people who are really stuck in this victim role and have that rigidity of mind, it's sort of like they've sort of curled up into fetal position, curled up like an armadillo, use whatever animal metaphor you'd like to here. And the purpose of that is to prevent abuse on a biological, physiological level. Basically, you want to go into your shell if somebody is bothering you because then they can't, harm you anymore, or put up your spikes or whatever like that. And this is an important thing to understand with people stuck in the victim role. I will get to that more in just a moment. And in terms of talking about people like object, this is because people who are in such a contracted consciousness cannot realize other people as people. They are objects to them. They are sometimes, if we're talking about other of the cluster Bs, they are people who cannot recognize as other people as people in their own right. They're extensions of themselves, or they are objects to utilize to project their own stuff onto. And this is really unfortunate for somebody in the victim role because um, they can't recognize that the commonality in their adult reality is them, that there is a reason that people don't want to hang out with them, that people may cut them off, and it's because they are so stuck in their victimhood that they are quite frankly can get to the point where they are delusional. They are operating untethered from reality. They are distorted and sort of contracted to the point where they have alienated themselves from all sorts of levels. And so, considering this on a spiritual level, this is really important to understand, especially if we're looking to understand this in a large scale way in the world today. Because if we have any clarity about the world, we can recognize that there is something significant going on in regards to mental health. If I were to put it simply, mental health sort of nosedive right before going into and after the pandemic. Basically, the kids are not okay, but the adults are not okay either. And on a spiritual level, this has everything to do with the disconnection and alienation. What happens to somebody who does not have proper social outlets? They cannot connect to others, or they don't have the capacity to connect to others, is that it impacts their mental health. Now, if we take somebody who is already fairly untethered from reality, who is struggling with mental health, who maybe experienced some form of trauma that taught them that they were unlovable, that they were worthless, and, kind of put themselves in that turtle shell as a child, is that they're going to come out of that experience feeling totally disconnected from reality, feeling totally disconnected from other people, and feeling totally sort of closed in that turtle shell, completely feeling alienated. And so there can be a lot of compassion here, but there can also be the question of what isolative effects are doing on an individual as well as a mass level. If we all get to choose our quote unquote truth, what happens to reality? And a lot of us are living that out right now, or are able to see that right now. What happens when, the collective threads of reality that garner truth have a lot of people who are fighting against that, who don't recognize that, who are not capable of connecting like that, because every single person that they connect to they're coming with this narrative of themselves being the victim. And if the other person doesn't fit into their narrative, they are going to harm or abuse them or make them just simply go away or cut them off, because healthy minds, healthy people don't want to be around somebody that is so negative and who is playing out their alienation, their feelings of lack of self-worth, lack of self-hatred with other people. And so it becomes a very unfortunate situation, because you can have people in this very rigid victim role who are not willing to see any other reality, are not able to see that this victim role that they have are playing out is so dominant and has such a bad effect on them, has such negative consequences for them. And the more malevolent people in this group utilize the victim role without consciousness to harm and abuse other people, and they cannot process it because they're not in a place to process any of their shadows. And so, on some level, all of us are guilty of this unless we really start to look at this and really start to break it down. Because all of us are guilty of pointing to, for example, loud people, like I just pointed out, like very dysfunctional people, people who are completely severed from reality in such a way that they are creating immense harm for other people, even while maintaining moral righteousness in the role of the victim and a really rigid mentality towards themselves and towards reality. But all of us at some point have experienced the role of the victim. And so I'm going to talk about shades of gray of this, because all of us have taken upon ourselves to experience moral righteousness, we are right, other people are wrong, as a way of casting our shadows. We are all guilty in some way of all of the isms out there. And that is often not out of malice, but because we haven't come into contact with that group, or we have been conditioned to look upon certain groups of people a specific way. We have all been guilty at some point of projecting our sort of delusions, our fantasies, our desires, our understandings, our problems onto other individuals as well. It's just really a question of severity. Somebody in that very severe category may project and create a relationship where they're projecting onto somebody as an object that has nothing to do with the person at all. It is everything about the individual projecting and nothing to do with the object, because that is an object to them. It is not a fully fledged human. And so their individuality, their humanness, the fact that they suffer and laugh and cry and, have a narrative all their own never comes into their minds. For most of us, we are willing to recognize people that are like us as human and may have difficulty with others. For example, part of spiritual awakening, especially the latter part, can be confronting just how many isms that we contain within us, that we may actually feel hatred, malice, or just simply separation from men, from women, from children, from humanity as a whole, um, from people of a particular religion, class, caste, of a particular weight, of a particular hair color, of a particular way of being in this world, of a particular diet or lifestyle. And so one of the things that happens during some of the medium to like moderate to later stages of spiritual awakening is that you start to recognize oneness. And so oneness on a larger level is like very much like an sort of experience. But on a very physical human level, it is about looking at what people as individuals or groups we have cast our shadows on, we express hatred to, we just simply don't really recognize as people in some capacity. And coming to the point where we can recognize the beauty in our differences, but also that we are all one, and all of that. But let's go back to the victim role. All of us are guilty in some regard or another of, taking on the morally righteous role and casting all of our sins, all of our difficulties onto other people. And in this, we still perpetuate divides. I am not saying that you should, watch some, TV show about psychopaths and be like, yes, that is a wonderful person. That is not what I am saying at all. What I am saying is that when you look at people, having the capacity to see those same qualities in yourself like a mirror is a big deal. And I recommend my book, Shadow Work for the Soul, for doing this, as it will take you through all of that terrain. And this goes into considering the superiority inferiority loop as well, is considering how we use specific narratives to blind ourselves to a clearer, more stable, more grounded reality. And one of those largest narratives is ourselves as victims. And I will say it is never our fault what we experience as children or even young adults, but it is our responsibility as adults to ensure that our own garden is tended, so to speak, that we do not create harm in this world, ideally for ourselves, but especially for other people, because we are stuck in a narrative like the victim narrative. But we could also talk about this with shades of gray, because most of us will not be that reactive or untethered from reality. What tends to happen to most of us is that we have been genuinely victimized, and we not only feel hurt from that, but we feel the lingering hurt from previous experiences where we have been victimized or harmed, either similarly or just in general. And so this brings about very common victim roles or victim understandings of reality. The universe is out for me, people are out for me, people are no good, I hate people, people are against me, why does everybody abandon me, all of this sort of stuff. And I will be the first to say that part of really moving beyond the victim archetype is to truly accept and to feel every single time that we have been victimized. And so going through that emotional as well as spiritual labor is absolutely necessary. We can't mantra our victimhood away. We can't, say, I am a hero now, I am not a victim. Those things might be kind of a stopgap, but the real work is really digging in and looking at why that role is so prevalent for you. And for some of you, it may be a dominant role in your life. And for most of us, it is one role out of many that we can experience within us. And if we were to talk about a healthy victim role living through us, because the objective is to move beyond it, not to eradicate it completely, is to recognize that, hey, some unfortunate stuff happened to us, but we are no longer living in that past. We've done the work, so our consciousness, so when we are triggered, we are not no longer a 2-year-old in a 50 or 60-year-old suit or a 30-year-old suit, so to speak. We have taken care of ourselves to that extent. And I do realize that it takes work to get there. But part of the good thing about people who are not so fixed in this role, do not need this role, because otherwise they would have to become aware of the harm that they've created in this world. Is that most of us can take stock of ourselves and be like, you know what, I've played this out, this victim role out. It maybe even I've been manipulative with it in the past, or I've used it to harm others in the past. I don't want that for myself going forward. Or maybe it's even more moderate than that. Maybe I really thought I was a victim in this situation, and now I can see the complexity. When our minds are quite rigid, when we are very stuck in the victim role, everything is black and white. I am good, you are bad. I am amazing, morally righteous, awesome, filled with light. You are the utter darkness, Satan, evil, horrible, awful sort of things. There is no dynamics, there is no shade of gray, there is no reason, there is no, there is no understanding or compassion. There is just good, bad. For most of us, if we are able to see some of that rigidity within ourselves and start to move past it, we can start to exist in those varying stages of gray, in which we can understand others and feel compassion for them. But at the same point, we might not agree with them. We may even, think of them as, whatever our thoughts are of them, that they are not intelligent, that they are not informed, that they are unwell, mentally healthy, mentally unhealthy, spiritually unhealthy. They aren't very conscious, whatever your thoughts are that come out about people, they are likely very true. But the question is, if you are treating the person as an object, if you are dehumanizing them, if you are thinking lesser of them as a result of that, are you painting yourself into the role of victim in order to not look at something in your life? Are you able to, at a certain point, recognize that you have been victimized, you have been harmed in your reality, and there is a real need to spend some genuine time examining that, feeling that, and accepting that in a very embodied way? And so it may surprise some of you or it may not, but denial is one of our most primitive mechanisms against reality. And so what can happen with us is that if we have been victimized, 98% of ourselves might accept it, or 50%, or 5%, or wherever we are at with things. But I've certainly had people come to me over the years and recognize that mentally they have accepted and understood how they have been victimized. Maybe they even know the reason why my parents were like this, the school children were like this, et cetera, et cetera. But they haven't felt it yet. They haven't felt in an embodied way. Their bodies haven't told the stories yet. And so by going into the body and having the body tell its story, I suggest my work, The Body Deva, for this, but there are a lot of great approaches out there, that there can be a recognition and acceptance and even a working with the consciousness that has been victimized, inner children, so to speak, so that they can express themselves and so that our adult selves can fully accept that victimhood. And what happens when we fully accept that victimhood is that we can move on from it. We can move on from the stories that it tells. We can move on from the rigidity that it creates and all of the sort of loops in our lives that keep on ongoing, that create a cycle of harm for ourselves and others, and quite frankly, for the world as a result. I will end by saying one last thing about the world and about shadows is that, like I mentioned, going into and since the pandemic, there has very much been an epidemic of loneliness, of people who feel disconnected, but also people who no longer have the capacity to connect. They may even be in a state where they are actively pushing people away, but of course they may not be conscious of that. This is again the turtle in the shell thought, is that if somebody is desperately lonely, but their behavior, their actions are so egregious that they are pushing others away, if everything in them is, basically shouting, screw off, but inwardly, because it's a defense mechanism, but everything within them is desperately lonely. What we get is an epidemic of loneliness. What we get is an epidemic of people who are disconnected from reality and who go into rigid roles like this because they are no longer connected. They are no longer tethered to a communal reality, to communal clarity. They're that turtle in the shell. They have nobody questioning their narrative because it is easy to go online these days and find people who are similar turtles in the shell, so to speak. And in many cases in our reality, it may even be rewarded. We may reward people who have low degrees of empathy, low awareness for other people. I mean, turn on any reality show and we can see we can see how this very much is an inflated sense of self. We can see how in our reality this legacy is being very much played out and being rewarded in our reality right now. So, long story short, how to come out of the victim role. Recognize that parts of you are in that role. Recognize that those parts of you may need to fully accept that certain experiences or events that have caused for you to be the victim have very much happened. We can only move away from our victimhood when we have fully accepted and processed it. Then we can ask ourselves more conscious questions of the shadows we are casting. Who are we morally righteous to? Who do we identify as objects rather than people? Who do we notice the hypocrisies of? If we start getting into those questions, we can start to reflect that back onto ourselves with the thought of, hey, maybe I'm a bit morally ambiguous sometimes myself. Maybe I'm not perfect. Maybe sometimes I've done the wrong things. In other words, maybe sometimes I've been human. And that can start to tear apart the threads of this narrative until it no longer is a primary force or primary story, especially a detrimental one in your life. I will end by saying one last thing, which is that reading the stories of other people, especially people from groups or realities that are much different than yours, very much helps. Travel, if you're able to, very much helps. Connecting to people who are unlike you very much helps. And this may be, may not be a looks thing. It may just be connecting to somebody who thinks differently than you. Most of us become very rigid in our thinking. And so we only wish to surround ourselves with people who think exactly like us, who look exactly like us. And if we are able to branch out to look at the outliers, people who think differently, and start to consider what they say instead of wanting our own thoughts, our own ideas about reality reflected back to us, um, we can grow enormously and become incredibly more conscious.